Now, I'm not actually personally a hardcore singularitarian, which may surprise some of you, but I've always been very intrigued by the concept and took it on as a sort of a challenge to see if I could write a meaningful fictional story about that would be set after the singularity. And that led to these books, starting with The Quantum Thief and its sequels. And as I was writing them, I became aware of this Russian thinker called Nikolai Fedorov, who'd sort of anticipated ideas that sounded very much like the modern idea of the singularity already back in the 1890s. And in the Quantum Thief books, that was just a little side note, but after finishing the books, I kind of was intrigued by it and started wondering whether there had been times in the past where it felt like the singularity was coming, and what did it feel like to live in those times? And it turned out that this was very much the case, and the result was my recent novel Summerland, which just came out. It is a spy story set in an alternate world where a very different kind of singularity has just taken place. Scientists have proven that the afterlife is real and can be contacted via radio. And it was inspired by real-life Victorian spiritualists, ideas from four-dimensional geometry and etheric physics. And today I want to tell you more about all those crazy ideas and tell you some stories from real history, and maybe we can discuss all together what those stories can teach us about our present-day worries and hopes about the singularity. So, to start with, let's go back to back in time 180 years to 1838, and to the invention of the electric telegraph. And so 180 years ago, Samuel Morse sent the first telegram in the United States, and that was across just 2 miles of telegraph wire. But telegraph sort of exploded at an exponential rate, and just 10 years later, there was 6,000 miles of telegraph cable in the United States. So that's 6,000 miles in just 10 years. And Tom Standage has actually called the telegraph network the Victorian internet. And I think that's a very good parallel. There was this explosion of growth, Wild West period of sort of different competing technologies and different companies, and ultimately sort of consolidation when the Western Telegraph Union was formed. And it became sort of a Google of its time, and by the year 1900, it controlled 1 million miles of telegraph lines. Now, very close to where Western Union was headquartered, in Rochester, was a small town called Hydesville. And in March 31st, 1848, something quite strange happened there. These two sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, started receiving messages from the afterlife. And the messages came as rapping noises that had a code, sort of multiple raps for no, one rap for yes. So quite a lot like the Morse code in the telegraph. And initially the girls told their family that the messages came from this creature called Mr. Splitfoot, maybe the devil, but later sort of changed their story and said it was the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered in their home. And as it happened, the Fox family was friends with quite an influential radical Quaker family that lived in Rochester, and the Quakers got very, very excited about the possibility of directly communicating with the dead. And they sort of formed what became the core of the spiritualist movement. And suddenly there was this explosion of mediums. The Fox sisters got hundreds of imitators. They themselves became very famous, and Horace Greeley, the newspaperman and politician, sort of took them under his wing. And the timing was sort of right for something like this. The US was going through what is now known as the Second Great Awakening. And that was kind of a Protestant religious revival that emphasized the personal relationship with God, sort of came with fascination with the supernatural and sort of romanticism. So people got very excited when suddenly there was this, what you could describe as an open source religion that promised direct lines of communication with the dead. Because the early spiritualists were associated with groups like Quakers and Universalists, they were also very much into social reform, so abolition of slavery, women's rights, and so on. And mediums are actually mostly women, so that sort of gave them a new kind of voice that helped drive some of those issues. But when I kind of looked into this, what really surprised me was how closely the language used to describe mediums was associated with telegraphy. So here's a period drawing that describes a spiritual telegraph sort of crossing the Atlantic. And some mediums actually started using telegraph transmission hardware. So they first they took sort of existing telegraph hardware to channel spirits, and then actually started building their own hardware for contacting spirits. So here's one example, which is an alphabet wheel for communicating with the dead, but it's actually modeled after a contemporary whetstone design, one of the early alphabet wheels that made it easier for a telegraph operator to read the incoming message. So there's this very interesting feedback loop between the hardware that the mediums used and the hardware that the telegraph operators used.